And now, a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, narrated by Bob McHone.
In the year 1809, the United States was a nation young and rough. The hills were covered with huge trees and threaded with blue crystal rivers, where silent Indians sailed their birch canoes. In that year, 1809, in a cabin in Kentucky, a scrawny baby boy was born. His mother named him Abraham Lincoln, a heavy name for such a little baby. So they called him Abe. Abe grew up in those hills, far from the eastern cities of civilization. He learned what all backwoods boys learned: to plow, to plant, to trap rabbits, and split rail fence. He grew to be a gangling boy with long arms and legs and a big, warm grin. When he was 14, overgrown and awkward, all knees and elbows, his family moved to Indiana, to what is now Spencer County. 2 years later, the boy's mother died, and not long afterward, the boy's father moved to Illinois, to New Salem. But the lad, now a man by the standards of that day, had already started to earn a living, hauling farm crops down the Mississippi on a flatboat. He was 19 then, lean and tall and tough, like a young hickory tree. On both sides of the river was a country wild and free, a green country, green and gold, as fresh as morning after rain. And Lincoln loved it, all of it. He leaned on the side of the boat and watched the land drift past, watched the bears and deer come down to the river edge to drink, watched the misty twilight come up the river, and laughed with joy. My country, the whole blooming, bursting, sprawling, blessed lot of it. One country. But the flatboat was a lonesome life, and Abe Lincoln loved to talk to people. When he was 22 years old, he took a job clerking in a store and doing odd jobs in town. The Black Hawk Indians went to war, and young Lincoln volunteered. The first 30 days, he was a captain. Then his time was up. But the war wasn't over, so Lincoln volunteered again, this time serving as a private. He didn't care whether he was private or a captain. Either way, he was a soldier. He served for 90 days. And if he were alive now, he would probably make a joke about that. The 90-day wonder. The wonder of it was, in the whole 90 days, he saw no fighting. Abe hung up his rifle and went back to the store and clerked. He liked the job so much he borrowed money and bought the store. He worked from before dawn until long after dark, but money in those days was scarce, and the country boy with the engaging grin had lots of personality, but not much business sense. The store failed, and the 24-year-old Lincoln, like a lot of people today, found himself with a pile of bills he couldn't pay. Through friends, he got a job as postmaster, a poorly paid clerking job in those days, and had the schoolmaster teach him enough arithmetic to let him qualify for the post of deputy surveyor. So, selling stamps and surveying boundary lines, and in his spare time doing odd jobs for anyone who would hire him, he managed to eat and pay back some of the money he owed. Once, partly out of desperation and partly just for fun, he had stood for a seat in the legislature, and to his surprise, and probably to his delight, he had polled almost half the vote. When he was 25, he ran again and won the election. And how he loved the State House. The man who liked so much to talk was getting paid for talking, and the talk amounted to something. He won 3 re-elections and became a respectable fellow. Something about him. His tall, thin frame, his hollow cheeks, the laughter in his eyes, the voice that came rumbling and crackling out of him with a twang hung on to the end of it. The people liked Mr. Lincoln, and Mr. Lincoln liked the people, the way two men do who trust each other. For he was now Mr. Lincoln, but he was still the same old Abe, a man of stature, but still a man. The farm boy, the hunter, the hillsman, the boy who poled a flatboat down the river. That was still part of him. And he still loved the big land, that most of all. But far away the drums were rumbling, and tempers were getting short. Within the Union Mr. Lincoln loved were the seeds of two nations. In the North was a nation of commerce and expansion, industry and trade. Down in the South was a different nation, a slow and gracious land of illiterate gentlemen, rough but gallant men who planted crops and spent their days on horseback hunting, the nights laughing and drinking and damning the Yankees. A nation of business and a nation of farms and slaves. Hired labor in one nation, slave labor in the other. And the great green country was split in two. Pain replaced the laughter in Lincoln's eyes. Those burning eyes had seen the country whole, and that pounding heart had determined that it should continue that way, whole, one nation, under God. One nation, conceived in liberty. What were the words? Dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. All men. Even the black man. Lincoln ran for the Senate of the United States. He lost the race, but won a reputation. He was the champion of the Republic, a single nation. And in the troubled year of 1860, the 51-year-old Lincoln found himself the President of the United States, now no longer united. 7 southern states were in secession, and others were threatening to follow. The garrison at Sumter was reinforced. A shot was fired, and the House was divided. The Civil War flamed like a raging fire. Shiloh, Chickamauga, Bull Run, and Gettysburg. The war that started almost like a camping trip was turned into a nightmare. The young men rode off like young knights and came limping home with horror in their throats. Thousands were dead, then hundreds of thousands, and the land grew up in weeds. The plows were rusty and the harnesses were rotten, and hatred stared this nation in the face like some mocking skull. But Mr. Lincoln did not hate. For him there was sorrow, but not despair. In 1863 he stood where so many before him had stood and died standing. He listened to a long and highfalutin speech, as bored as anybody else. Then, when at last the droning was over, he rose, glanced at his sheet of paper on which were written the words of his heart and soul. He straightened up, put his hand behind his back, swallowed hard, and spoke.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. But from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Like relentless millstones, the years of war ground into dust the lives of North and South alike. The proud bugles grew faint, then faltered. The Confederacy lay dying, and even the Union was weary and heartsick. Victory had the taste of copper pennies in the mouth. The river of this nation's life was shrouded into the fog of death. The sun sank low into the hills, and fear was the shadow that lengthened over the land. In Washington, the capital, were men more savage than soldiers, men vicious in victory, determined to flay the lifeless body of the South. Lincoln alone was able to understand that in this war there was neither victory nor defeat, just as there is no victory for the man who ceases to torture himself. Lincoln was not a Northerner. He was an American, a man who loved and was loyal to the whole of the land. He determined to show mercy to the South, to bind up the wounds as tenderly as a father might care for an injured child. On April 9th, 1865, the last faint bugle note faded away. The guns grew silent, and General Robert E. Lee delivered his sword to General Grant. Dixie was dead. The United States of America were weak from loss of blood, but still alive. And the weary Mr. Lincoln got down on his knees and thanked God. The anguish of 4 years of war had left him aching with grief. But now it was over, and mercy would prevail. the gentle ointment of forgiveness would heal the wounds of the nation. 5 days later, seeking rest, the president sat in Ford's Theater, watching an English comedy called Our American Cousin. At 10:15 and after, John Wilkes Booth crept to the back of Lincoln's Lodge, shot him in the back of the head. Panicky friends carried him to a rooming house across the street, and the next morning he was dead, 56 years old. With him died the hope of mercy, even the hope of justice, and bitterness worse than war spread like poison through the country, causing damage that is not yet repaired. But if ever there was a man immortal, it was Abraham Lincoln. His body lies entombed, but no grave can imprison his soul. Upon the fields and rivers of this land, in the woodlands and in the city streets, in the country courtrooms, and in the halls of Congress, his spirit lives. His compassion and his laughter are as real today as they were 100 years ago. And so long as there is mercy in the heart of man, the gangling ghost of Lincoln will not perish from the earth.
You've just heard A Portrait of Abraham Lincoln, written by Jerry Simpson, narrated by Bob McHone, and produced by Jerry Clegg. This is Tom Gager speaking.